East Coast heroes, along with Alan Altshuler. And it took me 2 years to get him here, so I think it's worthy of celebration. Professor Gomez-Ibanez is the Derek C. Bach Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy at Harvard, where he holds a joint appointment in the Graduate School of Design and the Kennedy School of Government. I won't go on with his many accomplishments, but many of you should have this handout, which has his bio on it, along with an abstract of what he's going to talk about today. As always, I take this opportunity to let you know of upcoming activities that may be of interest. On March 24th, the Council of Supply Chain Management Southern California Roundtable that Metrans is co-sponsoring on greening the supply chain. The ITS America annual meeting in 2009 in June. And remember, the National Urban Trade Conference in October, and soon you'll be getting messages regarding submitting abstracts and papers to that conference. So that's all I have. Sorry. For the students, the APA Student Paper Competition, remember there's a Transportation Planning Division paper prize, and we love it when our students get the prize. Last year we got 3rd place, so I would like to see something better this year. We were wrong. And then finally, our last Metrans seminar of the semester is April 29th, W. Meyer and Davis. So thank you for allowing me to do my announcements. And Professor Gomez-Ibanez, we have until 1:30. Some people will start creeping out early because they have class, but we won't let that bother us, right?
There's no official clock here. Thank you very much, Jen. It's a real pleasure to come here. I hate to say this as a committed East Coast person, but the West Coast is really the capital of transportation research in the United States, and it's thanks in part to people like Jen, whose work we read and admire enormously. I work on infrastructure. I work on 2 kinds of issues in infrastructure. One is the role of the public and private sectors, and when you should have private providers and when not, and if you're going to have private providers, how should you regulate them? Particularly the concern of monopoly regulation. In the second area, I work on infrastructure in cities. And what kind of infrastructure does a fast-growing city need? How can you tell when a city is underinvested in infrastructure and the like? I work a lot in developing countries as well as the United States. But for this talk, I'm thinking that people would be more interested in the United States than in developing countries. I decided to revisit a book I did some 15 years ago with my colleague and mentor, John Meyer, on the role of the private sector in transportation, and particularly in highways, and see where we are almost 2 decades later. And I'm going to talk about highway PPPs, public-private partnerships, and the infrastructure crisis. I must tell you that the link between these two is a little tenuous and unclear. But the basic outline of the talk is whether or not there's a crisis briefly, and then what the potential is for PPPs to contribute to our infrastructure in the United States, and what the most recent experience tells us. And let me just say, to start, that I don't think the infrastructure crisis is a financial crisis. People often talk about it as a financial crisis. It's not really a financial crisis in the sense that we are unable to borrow money for transportation infrastructure. It's really a crisis in the sense that we're unable to repay the money that we would like to borrow for the infrastructure that we think we need. And there's really kind of an impasse here. Lots of the experts say that we need to spend more on infrastructure when the public is not buying it. They're basically unconvinced that that infrastructure spending needs to be increased, or at least unwilling to authorize the increases in tolls and gas taxes and the like that would be necessary to invest in more infrastructure. I think part of the problem is, of course, that it's not clear how big the crisis is, how big the need is. A lot of the estimates that you see from the American Society of Civil Engineers, etc., are by self-interested groups and not based on very detailed data. And the kind of aggregate data is ambiguous. This is cribbed out of a recent Congressional Budget Office report testimony, but as you can see, and unfortunately it includes water as well as transportation. I'll show you a little more detailed breakdown in a minute. But as you can see, the transportation or infrastructure investment has been increasing, spending has been increasing since 1956, both federal and state and local. But it's been in real terms. Right? So our real infrastructure spending is higher than it's ever been. But as a percentage of the GDP, it's dropped. And frankly, none of us really know whether that's something to be worried about. There have been so many changes in the structure of the economy since the 1950s that whether we should be investing in the same level in infrastructure as we did back then or did in the heydays of the interstate is just unclear. Here's the breakdown of federal only and by mode. And so you can see, even in highways, we're spending more in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, than we did in the heyday of interstate construction. And in mass transit spending, which is the dark blue line in the middle, has gone up even more. So I think, though, the best estimates that I can find is this CBO compilation of estimates that they trust. And they break it down into three different columns here. One column is the actual level of spending in 2004. The next column over is the investment needed to retain the current level of service, and then the far right column is what is economically justifiable. And the highway numbers, which are what we're mostly concerned about and which make up the biggest numbers in there anyway, come from the Federal Highway Administration's Needs and Conditions Report, which is a biennial report based on a sample of highway segments that applies simple benefit cost rules to and prices to see whether or not they should be widened or repaired or whatever. And to me, given the nature of such exercises and their inherent limitations, the last time I looked at it, it seems reasonable. And what it says is that we probably should double investment. Although in fairness, the Conditions and Needs report will tell you that you get most of the benefits, the net benefits, from a fraction of the projects. I forget, I think 50% of the investment generates 80% of the net benefits, so you wouldn't have to double investment to get most of the benefits there. So if this is probably right, that we're under-investing in infrastructure, in particular in highways, why isn't the public buying? Well, there's two conventional wisdoms to this. One of them is that there's no compelling vision for the federal role in infrastructure. Right? That back in the 1950s, we had this compelling vision of building an integrated interstate system, and similar compelling visions for water and other infrastructure that have fallen off. Earth Day in 1969, the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, we were going to clean up our act in terms of water and wastewater treatment. By and large, that task has been completed. We built the interstate and so on. And so the argument is we need to convey to the country some compelling image of what we need and why, in particular, if you're talking about federal funding, why the feds ought to be involved in it. But I think the other part that people don't talk about too much is that our infrastructure programs have lost a lot of their legitimacy in part because of earmarking. And I don't know, here are the few statistics on earmarking that I could find. As you can see, the The first set of statistics has to do with the number of projects and the number of billions of dollars in the highway bills, and how much earmarking has increased over the last 20 or so years. And the bottom figure is what percentage of the Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, grant program funds are earmarked. And it's 15% in Federal Highway Administration, 28% in Federal Transit Administration. I don't know whether to think those figures are high or not. Some people who are really upset about earmarking, like Cliff Winston, say, look, this is highly leveraged stuff. The earmarking the earmark doesn't pay for usually much more than a fraction of the project cost, and so you're leveraging for bad investments 3, 4, 5 times those figures. And it's clear that in the public's mind, something like the Minneapolis bridge collapse, where all the experts were saying this will finally convince the public that we have to invest more in infrastructure, hasn't really worked. We don't remember the Minneapolis bridge so much as Senator Stevens' bridge to nowhere. One of the things, the pre-infrastructure, I think this was the previous infrastructure crisis, or infrastructure crisis, in any case, this typo here. But one of the things that I find curious, and I don't know quite what to think about, is that this is really the second infrastructure crisis that I've experienced, and possibly not many of the students, but many of the faculty. We had one of these before, and there were lots of similar influential reports, like that showed some American ruins or Rebuilding America. There were study commissions on the scale and prestige and effort of the ones that the two that just reported. The Fragile Foundations study commission report was very widely distributed, and we had some research. We had this famous Daniel Ashauer paper that purported to show that investments in infrastructure were so productive that they could repay themselves in less than a year. And it's kind of funny, it all faded out. I'm not sure how this infrastructure crisis actually ended. There were modest increases in the federal gas tax and, more importantly, in state and local taxation. And some of it shifted, as in California, from gas taxes to sales taxes for infrastructure spending. But somehow the crisis didn't bring America to ruins. We solved it short of that. And I'm not sure what the implications are for today. There was a little bit of a cry wolf back then, and then it's more serious today, or not. So, what about highway PPPs? When I did that book long ago, it was towards the end of the infrastructure crisis, as the infrastructure crisis was fading out, and I looked at PPPs and highways. And there are really two waves of PPPs. One was the wave that I looked at then, that began in the late 80s and continued to the mid-90s, and is in green in this chart. And the other is a wave that appears to be much larger, that began about 5 or 6 years ago here, and has the projects in the red there. It's actually so many projects in this second wave that it's very hard for you to keep track of them unless you, and they change, their status changes all the time. They're close to financial close, and then they fail, and then they get reauthorized, and so this is really kind of the biggest and most important projects and/or emblematic projects. But I think it's helpful to classify them in two respects. One is the standard greenfield, brownfield. A greenfield project is a brand new highway. A brownfield project is an existing highway that you're widening or improving or just maintaining. And of course, the greenfield projects are financially and politically a lot riskier in that financially in the sense that you're really dependent upon how fast the traffic will ramp up. If it doesn't ramp up on schedule, you are in trouble. You don't have a proven track record for the traffic volumes. It's risky too in terms of construction. With the brownfield, you're not doing construction, you're not doing as much construction. And it's risky in the political sense in that there are conflicts over whether the road should be tolled or not, and environmental permitting and the like. But the other dimension that I want to focus on that I wouldn't have focused on 15 years ago is the relationship between the tolls and the investment cost. And are the roads financially self-supporting or not? And the old wave was largely greenfield projects that were financially self-supporting from tolls, or were supposed to be financially self-supporting from tolls. Often that proved not to be the case. But now there are some situations where you are doing projects where there's a significant upfront payment by the concessionaire to the government, where tolls are going to be in excess of what is necessary to recover the cost. And so they're generating surpluses. And we've got some projects where tolls are less than cost, they're essentially subsidized. But let me talk a little bit about this first wave and then the second wave. As I said, the first wave came to very little. It was mainly greenfield projects that were financially self-supporting. There were about a dozen states that dipped their toe in this water at the time, with authorizing legislation for PPPs and maybe some preliminary offering to see if there was private sector interest in a particular PPP. There are only two states. I may have this wrong. There's a small road in Texas that I'm familiar with, but there are only two states, I think, that actually did anything, California and Virginia. And there were only 3 projects that were ever built as a result. The first project, and I think the pioneer, was the Dulles Greenway extension in Virginia. It's a slide. I'd like to see maps, but I'm not skilled enough on Google search to get maps of everything that I'm talking about. But downtown Washington's down here, and the Dulles International Airport is out there. And there was a toll road that brought people to, or a free road that brought people to Dulles International Airport, and on the sides of it, a toll road that was used to develop the suburbs there. And this was an extension, a 14-mile extension out in Loudoun County to Leesburg. And it opened, it was really pioneering the first. They started trying to do it in 1986. It finally opened in 1995. It went essentially bankrupt almost immediately because they happened to open this $300 or $400 million road just as Washington went into a little bit of a recession. So Loudoun County didn't develop as fast as they thought. The parallel routes weren't as congested as they were hoping for. And it was finally refinanced in 1999 and then bought out by the Australian investment bank, Macquarie, in 2005. And so it's still operating toll road. They lost, the original investors lost their shirts, but of course the road is still there and still operating. The other roads, I don't think I've got a slide on that. The other roads that were built at that time were 2 in California. These actually came out of a bill called Assembly Bill 680 that was passed in 1988. It authorized 4 demonstration projects in California. They had a competition, and 2 of those projects were never built. One was a road up in San Francisco and the area that had so many environmental problems. I think they must have been smoking pot or something like that. And another one was an elevated expressway in Los Angeles over a canal here, which I think probably raised similar, whoops, Lisa's shaking her head, raised similar permitting problems, and showed generally the vulnerability of these private investors to delays like permitting. And time is money for a private investor, and delays are a bad thing. The that got built are the famous SR-91 hot lanes in Orange County, Riverside, which opened, I think, in '95 and had to be bought out by Orange County in the early 2000s, something like that. And the other one, which I was just amazed is still alive, it's just like a vampire who couldn't die, is the Otay Mesa Road in San Diego, the South Bay Expressway, which finally opened in 2007, 17 years after the consortium that won the bid was put together. And I don't know the story of that, but I was amazed.
A few people lost their shirts.
If I write, succession investors lost their shirts. So if you looked at this first wave, you'd say, well, it's interesting historical artifacts, but not so. But the second wave has been bigger. There's been more variety of types of roads, much more numerous. To a much bigger extent than before, there's been foreign involvement. I believe in all of the toll roads before, they had a foreign toll road operator. For example, in the SR-91 Coffee Route, the French private toll road company was an investor. But they were really an investor at a minor level. I think it was 10 or 15%. Now, these things are mainly foreign consortiums and investments. They're big toll road operators in Spain and France, in Portugal, Greece, Sintra, ACS, big investment banks that are transurban in Australia, like Babcock and Brown, and of course Macquarie, and so on. So the consortiums are usually foreign-led, and the interest is intense in these foreign investment banks and these foreign toll road operators in these projects. The other thing that's a little different too is that for the first time the feds have some skin in the game. They've got some money in it. In 1998, an act called the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, TIFIA, was passed, which allowed the federal government to guarantee certain loans or to actually do direct loans. And they've got, almost every deal has some TIFIA money in it. They've put in, I think, on their website that says they're involved in $3.8 billion worth of guarantees or direct loans on leveraging another $20 billion or so in other investments. In 2005, I think we passed as part of the safety law, a provision to allow private activity bonds to be used for $15 billion worth of them to be used for highways. So these are bonds that are then going to be exempt from federal taxation, even though they're for private activity. But they define highways, toll road highways, as being unacceptable, at least for $15 billion. So there's foreign involvement and there's federal support. You've got, again, some that are financially self-sufficient. You've got many greenways, some that are financially self-sufficient, like Texas State Highway 130. Some that have big upfront payments. State Highway 121, where there was a big political battle. Sintra won the concession, but the North Texas Turnpike Authority decided it wanted to do it, and so they reopened the bidding and against the violation of lots of nice rules. And the Texas people bid $3.4 billion instead of $3.2 billion for the road. And then there's some that are subsidized. There's a hot lane, a very expensive hot lane system being proposed for the Capitol Beltway in Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. And I think that of the $2 billion or so cost of that, about $1.5 billion is going to be privately financed, but the rest is going to come from private subvention. And the Miami Harbor Tunnel, which just died, was going to be a tunnel which we're financed entirely from what we call availability payments rather than tolls. the motorists weren't going to pay anything for it. The state would pay for the days that it was available. So there was no traffic risk to the concessionaire. And the reason for that was that this was a tunnel that was designed to bring trucks out of the Port of Miami away from the center and onto the interstates, and so they didn't want to have tolls to discourage it. But so a wider variety of greenfield projects with a wider variety of financial structures. But I think it's the brownfield projects that really got people interested, because if you think about greenfield, greenfield's problematic in part because we have about 50,000 miles of high-performance expressways in the United States, most of them untold as part of the interstate system already. So a greenfield project, you're looking for those few unbuilt sections that might be profitable or semi-profitable with tolls. And they tend to be of two types. They either tend to be development roads like the Loudoun County Dulles Greenway, where there's the risk of traffic, will the traffic materialize on time before your cash runs out and you go bankrupt. Or they're congestion reliever roads in the middle of metropolitan areas where the construction costs are extremely high, and you can only make your money 4 hours a day because the parallel routes are going to be uncongested and you're not going to be able to charge a toll. But the brownfields, this is new business, right? If you can, and it's got the private toll road operators all excited, because if you can open up that market, you open up 40,000 miles or 45,000 miles to potential concessions, and it could be important. And some of them are financially self-supporting. There are two short roads, one in Virginia, one in Colorado, which were built as conventional public expressways. In one case, I think it was a nonprofit corporation, but in any case, they were about to default on their bonds. And so instead, they restructured them as a concession and offered them, and Brisa, the Portuguese and Brazilian toll road operator, one of them, I think Central one the other, or ACS one the other. But in any case, they made them profitable by doing a couple of things. One was by lengthening the terms of the bonds and the leases, right? In both cases, leases of over 50 years, and by raising the tolls as well. But they essentially took them off the books. The most controversial and most problematic from my perspective have been a series of brownfields which are designed primarily to generate funds for other purposes. And this particular idea was really pioneered by Mayor Daley and his finance director in Chicago. And the first name, so in 2005, they held a competition for a 99-year lease of a road called the Chicago Skyway. It was owned by the city of Chicago. It's 8 miles long. It carries motorists from Indiana into downtown Chicago, commuters into downtown Chicago. And they sold it for $1.8 billion. This was a sale that got the attention of a lot of states and cities and people with other assets. And it started a wave of what has come to call asset monetization, monetizing the value of your asset and extracting it. Now, the reason they could sell it for $1.8 billion, which is important to understand, is because the concession contract required them to maintain the road to a high standard, but it also allowed them to increase tolls by the faster of 3 different options, including 2.5%, the CPI, and the GDP, real GDP. And that allows you to compound a lot. And if you think the parallel routes are already fairly heavily congested, you can get away with it. The only way in which this bid makes sense when you run the numbers is if they think they're going to increase real tolls very substantially. And the only reason this made sense politically is because the users of the road were foreigners. They were foreigners to Chicago. There were people from Indiana who were commuting into Chicago, but they lived in the Indiana suburbs. So this passed the city council by a vote of 40-0 or something. Chicago went on, is famous at least Midway Airport 2 years later, and just a couple of months ago, at least all its parking meters downtown for $1.5 billion to, again with significant rate increases programmed in the concession contract. So this stimulated the Indiana governor, Mitch Daniels. Worth noting that Daley is a Democrat, Daniels is a Republican. This is a bipartisan temptation to at least the Indiana toll road, which is a little longer than the Skyway, but it has some of the similar features in that it's a bridge. It's really a bridge between Ohio and Illinois, across the top of Indiana, and there isn't that much local traffic. There's enough to have caused Governor Daniels some problems, and he had to make some concessions to the counties that were in the northern part of the state. But essentially a very similar toll formula for toll road increases, toll rate increases, and a 75-year lease got him $3.8 billion. Enough to fund the uses of these funds, which we'll get back to in a minute. Quite interesting, but in the case of Chicago, they used about $0.9 billion to retire debt on the Skyway and on and city debt, and then about $100 million they couldn't resist to spend on current social programs, and then they put another $800 million in a reserve fund, in 2 reserve funds. And Mitch Daniels is spending his $3.8 billion. 3.2 is going to a 10-year program for highways all around the state, and $600 million, I think, is going into a similar reserve fund. This stimulated the crown jewels of the American toll road system, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, to think about this. And New Jersey backed off fairly early, but Pennsylvania, the Governor Rendell there worked very hard to try and convince the state legislature that this was worth doing, that this would solve the financial crisis they were having for the highways across the state and for the transit systems in Philadelphia. This was the Pennsylvania Turnpike is Interstate 76 going across from Philadelphia through Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. It also includes what's called the northern extension, Interstate 476, going up to my wife's hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and other places. But there's a lot of traffic on those roads, and they go through major metropolitan areas. And so even trying to back the legislature refused to authorize them to do this, and so he, Governor Rendell, held a competition anyway to get a bid to present to the legislature and say, see, now authorize this. And despite the financial crisis, he got a bid of 12.4, 12.8, something like it's a 12 point something, I'm forgetting the number at the moment, billion from, again, a Spanish toll road operator, and this time I think J.P. Morgan, an American investment bank. But the state senate still didn't buy it, and you can see why. There's a fundamental difference here in that there's 2 fundamental differences. One of them is that you've got a competing parallel interstate just a little north, about 100 miles north of Interstate 80. And the second reason is you're going through a lot of local traffic here. So the politics are going to be much harder than we were in Indiana. So that's what's been happening. There's a huge program in Texas, which I think in the interest of time we'll not talk about. But how do you think about this? I mean, how do we think about whether or not this is good public policy, these private toll concessions, and should be an arbitrary solution to the infrastructure infrastructure crisis, whereas some of the investment banks were actually saying, there's $30 billion in highways. In the stimulus package, they were saying it ought to be tied to private investment because then it would be leveraged. How should you think about it? I have a very simple framework, which is that these PPPs have very high transaction costs, as we'll talk about in a minute. And so what you want to do is look for PPPs where the transaction costs are reasonable relative to other gains. There has to be some, you shouldn't do these unless there's some offsetting advantage. And the transaction costs are high, really tens of millions of dollars spent, both by the state and by each of 2 or 3 or 4 bidders to prepare these things. Why the transaction costs are high? One is you have to have a very elaborate agreement within the consortium that's going to operate this system. The consortium usually consists of a construction company, a toll road operator, an investment bank, etc. And all of these investors and operators and so on need to be protected in over a period of concession life of 20 years or more. You know, you contrast that with the traditional procurement method. You have individual contracts with each one of these things. You have bond counsel from the state who issues the revenue bonds. You have a construction company. You later have a maintenance contract to resurface it. But there's a bunch of individual contracts between them and the state, but they don't have to contract with one another and coordinate. Here they do. A PPP where you're going to invest and be responsible for the contracting becomes enormous within the consortium. But then, and the topic of one of my more recent books, the real concern that I have is the contracting or the transaction costs between the consortium and the government. Right? There's enormous public interest in these concession contracts. In the first place, they're almost always elements of national monopoly. Right? If a road is going to generate substantial toll revenue in competition with parallel free roads, it almost, by definition, has to have some market power over those. So you have an interest or a concern about monopoly. The roads affect other routes. Right? You can't analyze the road. You can't have the road behave in isolation. How high the tolls are on this highway is going to affect the congestion on the parallel surface streets in Chicago. You know, what happens on the Pennsylvania Turnpike is going to affect the level of traffic on Interstate 80 that's parallel to it. So that there's system effects that you just can't ignore. You can't think in isolation. And of course, there are environmental and other kinds of issues. You know, there's a wonderful paper by Ken Small, which I've just been refereeing and recommending that it be published immediately, which talks about the theory of whether or not the private incentives for tolls, profit maximizing toll and profit maximizing investment is going to be the same as the social welfare maximizing toll. So that's clearly not. So you've got to have some control over it. And if you think about highways, we're using PPPs in a lot of other areas. We're using PPPs for office buildings and prisons, for the structure, not the guards, and so on. And when you think about highways relative to, say, a courthouse, we just did a courthouse in Los Angeles that was a PPP. There's just tons of constituencies for a road that there aren't for these other kinds of PPPs. And the constituency for the courthouse is probably the Superior Court judge, chief. If you make him or her happy, that's fine, but there's lots of conflicting interests that have a stake in the road. So the contract to protect them is difficult. And by the way, I think it's all made worse by the fact that we live in this federal system. The highway PPP programs in Europe are all national programs, and so there's one standard, a lot of learning. And in Canada and Australia, which are way ahead of us in terms of highway PPPs, have fewer provinces and 1 or 2 provinces. Victoria, in the case of Australia, in British Columbia, in the case of Canada, have kind of taken the lead and the other ones copy. Here in the great federal system of the United States, right, every state thinks it has a different idea. And since every state, every highway is a little bit unique, right, these contracts end up being kind of rediscovering the wheel as well. But there's a fundamental problem that I worry about, that was the subject of a book I wrote about 5 years ago, which is how you regulate the monopoly elements of this. And the traditional way to do this, the traditional method of oversight, is a concession contract. And you see that there's only one exception to these U.S. roads where they're not using the concession contract method, which is the Dulles Greenway, which is regulated like a conventional utility by the State Corporation Commission of Virginia. But all the rest, to my knowledge, are concession contracts. And the idea is that the concession contract has a complete description of the obligations between the concessionaire and the state. The concession is awarded competitively. A complete description so that no one can take advantage of each other during the life of it. Everything, all their obligations are agreed to in advance. And the concession is awarded competitively so that you're pretty sure the terms are fair. And the concessions, at least in the European model, are often only 20 to 25 years, so they're re-awarded periodically to make sure that the terms are reasonably up to date. The real problem with these concession contracts is what we call the incomplete contracting problem. And the problem is that you can't foresee, you may not be able to foresee all the important events that may influence the viability of the contract from either the state's perspective or the concessionaire's perspective. And if the contract proves to be incomplete, the choices are not very attractive, right? Often one or both parties have made durable and mobile investments that make them subject to opportunistic behavior on the other parties in the course of the renegotiations. Right? And worse, I think from a public policy perspective or from a political perspective, is that there's no way to renegotiate that is as transparent or fair appearing as the original concession contract competitive reward system. So that, particularly in developing countries where citizens don't trust their governments, there's often a suspicion of substantial corruption in the renegotiation of the contract. And I think so. This problem of the incomplete contract is hard to prevent, right? Particularly with long-lived contracts. The notion that we were writing 75 and 99-year contracts is just ridiculous. 99 years, I don't know what you guys are doing, the transportation innovation in California, they'll all be in helicopters or something like that, or maybe we won't need people to tell it, who knows. But whatever, the notion that we could have predicted 99 years ago, what the transportation system of today is like, is fairly laughable. And so it's hard, but even when you have 20 or 25-year contracts, it's much less of a problem, but it's still difficult. Right? And there are strategies to try and make these contracts living documents, including in arbitration clauses and buyout provisions and the like, but those have their own problems. They're hard to do well. And if you try and make the contract foresee everything, you often introduce rigidities into the contract that you don't understand. So, and this problem is serious. In developing countries where I work, there's this famous study by a man named Luis Kalash in the World Bank of 1,000 concession contracts in infrastructure in Latin America that were signed in the 90s. And, I forget the exact numbers, but the transport concession contracts, something like 75% of them had to be renegotiated within 2 years of their signing, or in the began the process of renegotiation. And if you think about the United States, we're not so different. SR 91 had to be renegotiated. If you think about the 3 old ones that we have, the Dulles Greenway didn't have to be renegotiated, but only because it wasn't a concession contract system, it was a public utility system. But it essentially, if had it been a contract, it would have had to be renegotiated because of the traffic conditions and the like. And South Bay, San Diego South Bay Road must have been renegotiated. I can't imagine how this thing survived, 20 years in purgatory to the marriage in 2007 or whatever, if it wasn't renegotiated. So renegotiation is a problem, not just in developing countries where the environment is much more unstable and so on, but it's a problem here as well. So if there are these enormous transaction costs, right, what's the advantage? What's the benefit? Well, one of the benefits that people talk to about, that's most often mentioned, and particularly in the context of the infrastructure crisis, is access to private capital. That is, we're going to finance this road privately, so you don't have to worry. But just one obvious point is any financing has to be repaid, but there's no free money. And in particular, just because you have private finance doesn't avoid the need to raise tolls or gas taxes or something to repay it. So it doesn't solve what I think is the fundamental problem with the infrastructure crisis, which is not our inability to borrow, but our inability to repay. But the other thing is that the public can also tap private capital by issuing general obligation bonds that are backed by the full faith and credit of the state, or by issuing revenue bonds that are backed by the revenues of the toll road operator or the project, and not the full faith and credit of the state. And that, the private sector's claim that they could do better, they argue we're innovative in finance and can unlock more value from these assets, I think is only marginally true if it is true. But the nominal cost of public debt is often cheaper, publicly issued private finance is often cheaper than private finance. The Skyway, for example, which was way pre-credit crisis, the Macquarie was saying that its weighted average cost of capital was 8%, which must have been very highly leveraged to get it down that low. Most projects are nowhere near that for private. But at the time, Chicago probably issued a general obligation bond for 6%, or a revenue bond against the Skyway for 7%, something of that order. And even though the private sector says we can unlock greater value because we can issue equity as well as debt, and public debt has often coverage ratios, limits on how much of the cash stream you can borrow against. 130% is a typical coverage ratio. But even at those coverage ratios, the amount you can borrow is essentially very similar. I have a little perpetuity calculation, embarrassingly simplistic. But if you've got a revenue stream from the Skyway for $100 a year in perpetuity at 0.8%, that means you get a $1,250. But if you've got a 130% coverage ratio, that means you can only borrow against 77 of the expected $100. But if your discount rate is 0.06, you end up with pretty similar. And you still have those quasi-equity payments. So now one of the things that people notice that's important for economists is that a lot of the advantages of public over private in terms of the nominal cost of capital is actually an illusion. It just represents a shift in the cost from one party to another. If you're using a full faith and credit bond for finance, then the taxpayer is taking the default risk and uncompensated default risk, and so you're just part of that difference is just that you don't have to pay the equivalent of equity to the taxpayer. And the revenue bond, the difference between the revenue bond and the private bond is largely the federal tax shields. The fact that it's the interest income from the bond is exempt from federal income taxation. But two things to say. I think one of them is the public doesn't understand that, right? And so all they see is that the toll rates are higher or similar with private finance as with public finance. And I'm not sure whether we haven't been moving in some directions to address that. In some ways wrong, bad. One of the reasons that these leases are often so high when the pressure is on to maximize the money is because they want to get a high enough, above 50-year lease, then they can use accelerated depreciation because the lease is deemed by the Internal Revenue Service as the equivalent of ownership. So they're trying to exploit a federal tax shield. And again, the TIFIA and private activity bond money. So I think this is the wrong reason. this is not a compelling reason to go through all that transaction cost to access the capital. Another reason offered is that they make tolling more acceptable, make the public more willing to raise gas taxes or tolls or whatever to pay back. And one argument, which I will not go into in detail, is that the projects are going to be better, and the public will notice that, and therefore the private sector is not going to fool around with white elephants, and so you'll have less of them, bridges to nowhere and so on. And I think that only holds if you really align the incentives in the concession contracts and the procurement system so that the private sector incentives are aligned with the public. But the simpler notion that they have is simply by tying the politicians' hands, and requiring that they get toll increases. It's obviously very difficult for public officials to raise tolls on existing roads or to impose tolls on roads that have not had tolls imposed on them before. And the notion is we'll make this part of the concession contract, and so they'll be contractually obliged to raise tolls every year with inflation or whatever. And Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, was very explicit about this. I mean, the Indiana toll road was actually losing money for the state because the state legislature was so timid about raising tolls. And the same with Governor Rendell on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. This is a real problem. Okay? The Pennsylvania Turnpike had only had something like 3 or 4 toll increases in its 60-year history. And although it was throwing off about $300 or $400 million in cash after operating expenses per year, the tolls were clearly very, very low. And I guess I think there are two things to say. I take this problem, but first of all, you can tie people's hands without using PPP. And that's what bond covenants are for. Right? You can write a bond where the covenant says that you have to, if the toll revenue falls below X% of the bond payment, that you're contractually obligated to raise tolls until you bring it into. So to the extent you believe that you can tie people's hands, you can do it with public finance as well as private finance. And the second thing is, I don't think you can tie hands forever. Right? I mean, as the negotiation with SR 91 proved, and I think at some point the Skyway in Chicago and the Indiana toll road they're going to have to be renegotiated. The tolls are just going to get too high. The congestion on the parallel routes, or the pain from the motorists, or the pain from the downtown employers of those Indiana commuters is going to get too high, and they're going to have to be. You can't tie too uncomfortable a knot. So let me just one or 2 last slides. What do I think the real reason for doing this is? I think the real justification for doing this is if you think that there are real efficiency gains from doing it rather than just transfers. And what I mean by efficiency gains is innovative services or lower costs. And what I mean about transfers is just transferring costs from one party to another. And these asset monetizations, the brownfield surplus generating toll roads, like the Chicago Skyway or the proposed Pennsylvania or the actual Indiana, I think are privatizations that involve mainly transfers and very few efficiency gains. What they're about really is an excuse to raise tolls on those roads and transfer the proceeds to other social programs in Chicago or other programs in Chicago or to other roads across Indiana and Pennsylvania and so on. The efficiency gains that are expected from the operation of these roads are very modest relative to the amount of money that's going to be essentially transferred from the users of the road to other social purposes. And I think this distinction between transfers and efficiency gains is really important because if all privatization is about transfers, then privatization becomes a zero-sum game, right? Then it's you lose and I win, or vice versa. If there are real efficiency gains, and of course the privatization, if the private sector can really maintain that toll road for less than the public sector can, or is going to put in hot lanes before anybody else in the public sector ever does, or electronic tolling, or whatever innovative services and pricing. Then there's a possibility that it's more like a win-win, or that the distribution of benefits across is not so unequal as it is in these asset monetizations. Now, I think there are reasons to believe that the prior PPPs and toll roads will bring these benefits, will bring real efficiency gains if the contracts are structured appropriately. I think the focused accountability of the private sector is important, and the fact that you have life cycle cost responsibility is important. Unfortunately, I think the sources of evidence that these efficiency gains are there is not the kind that would really satisfy academics. There are a couple of famous studies about public versus private in highways and other forms of infrastructure PPPs in the UK and in Australia, and they really have real control problems. Right? The PPPs typically have smaller cost overruns and smaller delays than the conventionally procured projects. But the PPPs were often selected precisely because they held some promise of having problems with that, and a more careful effort was often made, one suspects, to estimate how much it could cost to have some kind of public sector comparator, and how long it would take if done in conventional procurement. So I don't think the academic quality estimates are there, and if those of you who are intrigued by this talk are looking for a dissertation, although a very hard one, somebody who can do something about that. It's hard. Every road is a little bit unique, right? And so it's hard to find, and unfortunately we do not do randomized assignments and deciding whether to do PPPs and which we do not. But I think it's there. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the first hot lanes in the United States were in SR 91. Right? And I don't think, again, a Capital Beltway hot lanes was an unsolicited proposal for a massive project. I think there's lots of signs of their innovation. And I don't think it's hard to imagine that Sintra or Abertis or ACS knows more about running a toll road than the Chicago Street Department or even the Pennsylvania Turnpike Authority. I mean, these guys have thousands of miles of toll roads around the world, transurban, and are very sophisticated about the management of these assets. So I think this is the reason to do it, but you need to structure the contract. So what are the conclusions of this? I think in terms of going back to our infrastructure crisis, the transaction costs of PPPs are so high that you'll never see them in the numbers that are likely to play an important role. Although it's notable, right, that in this crisis they're playing a more important role than in the last crisis, that their use and acceptance is growing. I'm hoping that these asset monetizations, the Chicago, Indiana style privatizations die out, because I think they'll just ruin the prospects for any good privatizations. Like these are all transfers, or mostly transfers, no efficiency gains. 99 to 75-year leases bound to be incomplete. And I think you can also make an argument, which some people make, that they're kind of intergenerationally irresponsible, right, that you're mortgaging the future revenue streams for the use of crime. And some of them, in Pennsylvania, Governor Rendell promised to put the proceeds in a lockbox and spend only the interest. And that was ridiculous, too, to meet that intergeneration, because he was essentially borrowing money at 8% to invest in a lockbox that earned probably 5%. Which sounds like my 401k, but isn't what you're supposed to do, right? And again, but I think the PPPs are worth trying because I think the real efficiency gains are probably plausible, are plausible. And that what you want to do is to try and figure out a way to reduce those transaction costs while protecting the public interest by shorter concessions and fine. Sorry, yes, by my watch, unofficial timekeeper.
Just interjecting, I mean, Daley in and of himself has become sort of Don Shoup crazy, right? I mean, he's looking at privatizing parking lots and making parking charges very high, and and coming up with all sorts of privatization schemes as a means for traffic control, right? And so that's another sort of ideological agenda that we could get on here, and it's sort of the opposite direction of this whole notion of using privatization as a way of making money. It's also a way of trying to legitimize pricing on roads as a means to try to control the growth of auto use, right? And so that's essentially Daley's agenda, right? They're very, very sort of focused on being transit-oriented there.
Well, Daley's agenda is also cash.
Sure. Well, and this is assuming that the transit-oriented agenda isn't, sort of in many respects another real estate.
Yeah, but that's happening
universe.
elsewhere, like the Bay Area. I mean, the Bay Area and with the Manhattan congestion pricing program, those are both, kind of expressed as a means of managing behavior, but they don't go along with privatization, So, I don't know, it's just it seems like it's a mixed bag, and it's not something that necessarily corresponds with political party at all.
But something that strikes because of the history of debates about privatization strikes me.
Yeah.
At the top of your lecture, you were mentioning earmarks and influence, the growth mode that you thought that had on public support for infrastructure investment in general. I was wondering if I could push back just a little. There was a pretty good study, the large sample size that the Pew Center had put out when they went back right after the election. They surveyed people who had voted, and they asked them in an open-ended format, name for me the top issue and name for me the number 2 issue about who it is that you voted for. And 27 categories, earmarks never actually showed up. And it wasn't something that was subsumed within one of those other 27 categories. So I wanted to put that out there as maybe evidence that earmarks are not playing a role in this debate as much as people tend to think they are, as much as it shows up in the media.
I'd love to see that. My assumption that earmarks play a big role is based largely on my own personal reaction and the media. I don't know that there's any real study of it. People remember the bridge to nowhere.
Right.
Maybe they remember the bad earmarks.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you guys say?
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to know, is this public crisis generated by the lack of repair, or is it mostly generated by the lack of throughput and does it need to expand the system?
I think it's, my understanding is it's a combination. If you look at those CBO figures, you can see the lack of repair is probably 1/3 on the highways, but and then 2/3 is investments that are needed anyway. You believe? Yes. Well, it looks like lack of repair is even smaller, right? 66 to 78. Whereas underinvestment is. That's as good as you trust that model. But I think that model was made in an honest attempt.
I don't think I read these figures that way. I think $66 billion is total spending on expansion of the system and maintenance. I think maintenance is very underfunded.
Right. So you're level.
Maintenance is not
Yes, but
underfunded by
presumably
$12
the
billion.
effective under maintenance comes in more heavy investments required more frequent resurfacing. Right? What this model does, what the needs and conditions model does, is that it has a sample of I don't know how many thousand highway segments across the United States. And they're going to look at the condition. And they have a little benefit cost kind of algorithm that says should it be rebuilt or resurfaced or whatever. So if you've been under maintaining your highway for a long time,
Yeah, eventually becomes a major capital project.
yeah, it becomes a capital project that shows up here. Oh, sorry.
Okay. So ultimately, the responsibility of providing infrastructure, transportation, or you might watering one of the slides, rests with the government, right? So it's always public provision of infrastructure for people to drive on, so on and so forth. So you bring in a private partner, the consortium, whatever, tries for a few years, goes bankrupt, doesn't do it well, is not able to raise taxes, whatever, and bails out. And so ultimately the responsibility falls back on the government, right?
No, what happens when they go bankrupt is the original investors lose their shirt and somebody else, bondholders take them over and they're just refinanced. They don't go back into public hands.
So then it's not such a bad idea that you get a foreign consortium in, then because you're not loading your own local constituents with the
With
bad
that risk.
with that risk.
but you're also not exposing them to that profit too. The foreign people, I've been told, this is another hot wire issue, like private, although probably less so, but I'm told that one of the reasons for the battles in Texas, where they took back this highway and they put in a 2-year moratorium on new concessions, which is just about to expire, was because so many of the concessions were members were foreigners. So I think the perception may be not just that oh good, they're taking the risk, but oh no, they might be taking the profits. As a half Spanish guy, I hope that's not.
This is kind of a weird question, but if there is the opportunity to make profits on these investments, why hasn't the government already done that?
Well, because I think the government isn't as profit oriented. And you think about, the government has lots of constituencies and lots of responsibilities, and making money is one of the least of them. Right? Whereas the private sector, it's their bread and butter. I like to think about privatization as, the disadvantage of government, or the advantage of the private sector is this kind of focused accountability. Where those managers, those are held accountable by their shareholders for one thing and one thing revenue, one thing and one thing gain, which is how profitable the thing. And that focus is very important and motivating. It's also their weakness. Right? It means that they're not sensitive to community groups, environmental concerns, parallel traffic, anything else. So you have to structure the contract so that focused accountability is focused properly. It takes into account the wider concerns that the government has.
I guess that kind of leads to the next question, if there, if you were to start something new and meet all of society's needs with this infrastructure project, would it be profitable, or would there be too many, costs to cover the externalities and other impacts? Like, is it inherently a profitable investment or not? I guess that's kind of my question.
This sounds like a question I should punt. But I think the notion that users of infrastructure, unless there's important equity issues or important externalities, that the users of that infrastructure should pay the cost of infrastructure is pretty compelling. They receive most of the benefit, right? And if not all of the benefit. You could make an argument that some, for example, in wastewater treatment or in drinking water, that there's public health benefits, control of communicable diseases and prevention of pollution that others are exposed to. Therefore, you might not want them to actually, that's why we require that it's not your local option. You can't decide to put your sewage on your lawn. But, so there are situations, and there are cases where we worry about equity too. But generally, my strong presumption is the users aren't willing to pay for it, it calls into question as to whether or not it's really needed.
Also, the governments have made money from toll roads. The classic example being the Tri-Road Bridge and Tunnel Authority. But there's lots of other examples. The San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge paid itself off in 1953 and has been subsidizing different projects ever since. So, and those are both under public control. The public is and government is definitely not a monolith. There's lots of different varieties.
But there's also, the Pocahontas Parkway, it's the Seattle road that went bankrupt. But they can lose money too, just like the private sector.
Yeah. The distinction between public and private is always all that clear.
You mentioned that highway EPPs come slow in the U.S. because at this stage we have the only way to understand this, how to use PPPs. So what would you say, what kind of state intend to use private PPPs in highway, and what kind of conditions they would need so that the state...
if you think about the states, right, it's fast growth states like Texas, Virginia, California when they were, it's where you need the investment and you're having trouble raising it, and then more conservative states as well. We don't have one yet in Massachusetts. But I think the problem is, it really is, I think highways are tougher than others in terms of PPPs, in part because of the issue of monopoly, because of multiple constituencies, and because every highway project is a little bit unique. Imagine if you're building courthouses as PPPs, which they do all the time in Europe and in Australia, and I understand you just did one in Orange County. Those are pretty straightforward projects. I mean, they're essentially office buildings with large rooms and pretty limited constituency. You know, a highway just affects many more people and becomes much more difficult to manage contractually and politically.
Last question? If there is a last question? If not, we say thank you very much.